Hello everyone, this is Lala and today I'm going to be talking about the Big Brother edit via confessionals. I've done a few videos about this a few years ago where I ranked the jurors who had the highest and lowest confessional amounts, the pre-jurors with the highest low and lowest amount of confessional counts, and the same thing with the endgamers. But I'm not going to format this video like that. So my goal is to go over all of the Big Brother USA seasons and calculate whether the season overall, as well as the contestants in each season, is over edited, under edited, or perfectly edited. So, how I'm going to do this is very confusing, and I'm going to kind of cite another YouTuber who did this with Survivor Australia seasons. I'll put their information here, and you can listen to it there if I'm not going to explain it properly in my description of how I came up with this in a few seconds. So my process is I'm going to count or look up the overall amount of confessionals in a season, and then, so that will be the overall confessionals, and then I'm going to look up the episode sum. So this pretty much means if someone lasted 5 episodes on the season and they're the first boot, they'll have a sum of 5. The second boot would have lasted 8 episodes, and the third boot would have lasted 11 episodes. So I do 5 plus 8 plus 11 up until the first place person who lasted for, let's just say, the season's 30 episodes. I'll add plus 30 for the winner, and overall, once I add the amount of episodes each contestant was in during that season, and you come up with a number, that will be the episode sum. So, how to determine whether a season will be evenly edited, or if a season was evenly edited, each contestant would have a certain amount of a certain amount of confessionals by episode. And this is the rate by episode sum. So how I'm going to determine this is by dividing the overall confessionals in a season by the episode sum to come up with the rate by episode sum, which would be the average that every contestant needs in every episode for an even edit. So the overall confessionals, episode sum, and the rate by episode sum are the three main components of this. And that's just for this first part. The second part is going to be where I look at each contestant for that season. So, for an example, Justin from Big Brother 2, he has an overall amount of 12 confessionals or diary rooms. So, the overall will be the amount of diary rooms that a contestant actually has on the season. And then the next variable that I'm going to use is the expected count by episode amount. So this pretty much is just the rate by episode sum multiplied by the amount of episodes that the contestant was in. So Justin was in 4 episodes, so I'll use the rate by episode sum times 4. That will show a number. And that number would be the amount of confessionals that they should have had the edit been even. So the next part of this is we're going to compare the overall, meaning the amount of diary rooms they actually got, and the expected diary room count that they should have had based on the episodes that they were in the season. And we are going to pretty much subtract the expected count by episode amount from the overall diary room or confessional count, and this would come up with the final variable within this, which is the misallocation by episode. So that pretty much shows the differences between the amount of confessionals they got versus the amount that they should have gotten. And if this number is a positive, that means that they got more confessionals than they should have. If it's a negative, that means they got less confessionals or diary rooms that they should have. And by the end of this, we are going to add up all of the misallocations of each of the house guests into a number, which is the season total misallocation amount. and we'll have a number there. And then the final components that we're going to use is the percentage of confessionals misallocated. So we're going to divide the total misallocation amount for the season by the amount of diary rooms. And we'll have the percentage of confessionals misallocated. So that's the whole process, and if it's too confusing, look up the link that I will reference for a better explanation of this. Of course, the first season in contention is Big Brother 2. So the overall confessionals in this season is 1,628, and the episode sum, meaning adding the amount of episodes that each of the house guests were in, is 213. So the rate by episode sum that I found, which I used the two numbers, is 7.64. I could go on with the other numbers, but it's just way too long. But overall, this means that the rates by episode sum is 8 confessionals or diary room sessions per episode. And this is what everyone in the cast should get throughout all the episodes for there to be a quote unquote balanced edit. So the first person on the list is Justin, who overall has 12 confessionals, and the expected count by episode amount, which he should have had during his 4 episodes, is 30.5 onwards. Due to his overall being a lot lower than his expected count by episode amount, he has a misallocation by episode of negative 18.57. Cheryl overall has a confessional count of 18, and her expected count by episode amount is 30.57, since she and Justin were both in 4 episodes. Her misallocation by episode amount is a negative 12.57, so she's not as under edited as Justin, but still under edited. Autumn overall has the diary room confessional count of 35, and the expected count by episode amount for her for lasting 8 episodes is 53.5. Due to this, she has a negative 18.5 misallocation by episode, so she is also someone that is very under edited. Shannon overall has 66 diary rooms, and her expected count by episode amount is 76 confessional diary rooms. So her misallocation by episode is negative 10.43. So that is unedited, or a bit unedited, but still decent enough. So pretty much if you have a misallocation amount from negative 10 to 10, you have a decent enough edit. Anything above 10 is a large edit, and anything below negative 10 is a low edit. So Mike has an overall confessional amount of 100, and the expected count by episode amount for him is 99.36. This causes for a misallocation by episode of 0.63. So honestly, he has a pretty even edit akin to the amount of confessionals and the amount of episodes he lasted. So this is a perfect ratio, which really isn't common, and you'll see that as we go through all of the seasons. Kent has an overall diary room amount of 95, and his expected count by the amount of episodes he lasted in is 122. This causes for a misallocation of negative 27.29. So he definitely has a hugely under-edited confessional count. Krista has an overall confessional amount of 107, and her expected count by episode amount is 145. This causes for a negative 38.22 misallocation for her. Bunky has an overall diary room amount of 195, so almost double the last 3 people. And the expected count by episode amount based on the amount of episodes he lasted in is 183.43, causing for an 11.56 misallocation. So he has a bit more confessionals than he would have on a balanced edit, but he's on the borderline between fair and bloated. Hardy has an overall diary room count of 219, and the expected count by episode amount pertaining the amount he lasted in is 206.36. This means that he has a misallocation amount of 12.63 confessionals. So he's a bit over the average or perfect amount. So he's a bit over edited pertaining his confessionals, but it's not a big deal. Monica overall has 164 diary rooms, and the expected count by episode amount for her is 221.65. This means that she has a negative 57.65 misallocation. This is easily the hugest misallocation on a negative way, or on the negative lens, meaning that she is severely under edited, and no one else has as big of a rate as she did. Nicole has an overall confessional count of 292, and her expected count by the amount of episodes she lasted in is 229.29 rooms. This means that her misallocation is 62.70. So this is a huge misallocation in the positive lens, meaning that she is severely over edited based on her confessional count. Will overall has a 325 diary room count, and the expected count by episode amount for him is 229. This means that his misallocation by episode is 95.7 confessionals, meaning that he has almost 100 confessionals more than he would have had the season and the diary rooms been distributed evenly. So the season total misallocation, which I created by adding up all the misallocations from the house guests together, so the number for this is 31.14, meaning that there are 31 more diary rooms than there should be due to the unbalanced edit. As we go through the seasons, some will have larger numbers, some will have shorter numbers, so it'll be interesting to see what will come to be, and some will have bigger numbers in the positive or the negative as well. So some could have less confessionals than they should. So that'll be interesting to delve into. Honestly, their numbers weren't too huge for most of the house guests, but the large discrepancies came with the final three, where I think if they gave some of Will and Nicole's confessionals to Monica especially, the total misallocation number would be smaller for sure. Though in general, many of the earlier boots needed more confessionals, and Will and Nicole could have been distributed more towards them, if we're going by the arguments of the balanced edit. Now we're moving on to Big Brother 3, and the season has an overall confessional amount of 2,310, and the episode sum, which I used to add up the amount of episodes each house guest was in, is 259. So the rates by episode sum was used or created by dividing those two numbers, and I got 8.91 confessionals, which rounds up to 9 confessionals. So the average amount of confessionals that everyone would get in every episode for this to have a balanced confessional edit amount is 9. Lori has an overall diary room count of 41, and the expected diary room count pertaining to the amount of episodes she lasted is 44.59. This means that her misallocation by episode is negative 3.59. So overall, she has 4 confessionals less than she should have if this was a balanced edit. But her misallocation is very small, so in general, I feel like she got the amount that she should have gotten, give or take. Tanya overall has a diary room count of 32, and her expected count by episode amount, based off of the prior data, is 71.35. This means that she has a misallocation by episode of negative 39.35. This means that she has less than half of the amount of diary rooms that she should have gotten if this was a balanced edit. Eric overall has a diary room count of 90, and his expected count by episode amount is 124, meaning that he has a negative 34.86 misallocation by episode. So he generally needed about 30 more diary rooms. Josh has an overall diary room count of 166, and his expected count by episode amount is 151.62. This means that he has 14 more diary rooms than he should have gotten if this was a balanced edit, but he only barely bumped up to the over edited compared to some of the others by 4. So Kiara has an overall diary room count of 148, and her expected count by episode amount due to the average that would equate to a balanced edit is 178.37, meaning that her misallocation is negative 30.37, meaning that she has 30 diary rooms less than she should have if this was evenly distributed. Jerry has an overall diary room count of 146, and his expected count by episode amount is 205, meaning that his misallocation by episode is negative 59. So this is the largest number so far, even beating Monica's negative misallocation amount, so he's severely under edited. Roddy has a diary room count of 190, and his expected count by episode amount is 231.89, meaning that he has a misallocation amount by negative 41. And I'm honestly very shocked by this. I thought he would have had a lot more diary rooms in the season, especially pertaining to his role on the season. But I guess they just didn't find him that interesting, or there are just many others that stood out a lot more. Speaking of that, Marcellus has an overall diary room amount of 298, meaning that he has over 100 more diary rooms than Roddy, despite only lasting an episode longer than him. And due to this, Marcellus's expected count by episode amount is 240. His misallocation by episode is 57.18, meaning that he has 57 diary rooms more than he should have if this was going to be evenly distributed, meaning that he is very over edited. Amy has an overall diary room count of 227, and the expected count by episode amount based on the amounts that she was in is 214. This means that her misallocation is 12, which is a pretty good number and it's just a bit over the average balanced amount. Though in general, I still think she got a very balanced edit. Despite that, Jason has an overall diary room count of 286, and the expected count for him by episode amount is 276.48, meaning his misallocation by episode is 9.51. So he is in that perfect middle point where he has a very balanced confessional count and edit based off of this. Danielle has an overall diary room count of 387, which is over 100 more than Jason, and her expected diary room count by episode amount is 285. This means that her misallocation by episode is 101.59, meaning she has over 100 diary rooms than she should have if this was going to be evenly distributed. Danielle's a star, but oh my goodness, I believe this number is higher than Wells from Big Brother 2, and this will probably be one of the highest over edits in Big Brother history. Lisa has an overall diary room count of 299, and the expected count for her by episode amount is 285, meaning that her misallocation by episode is only 13.59. So she is a bit over that balanced median, but overall she has a good balanced distribution count. So this is interesting. I added up all the misallocations via house guess, and I got this number, which is 0.000000. I believe it's like 8 decimals of zeros before we get 49. Pretty much meaning that the misallocation is perfect. And because of this, I couldn't really divide it into anything since the number is way too small. So despite Danielle and Marcellus having more diary rooms and a lot of the earlier boots having less diary rooms, it isn't to the point where it's overall unbalanced regarding the distribution, where in seasons that we'll see in the future, the season misallocation is a lot larger. So some people are over edited to the point of ridiculousness, some are under edited, and honestly, this just shows that no one in Big Brother 3 got a ghost edit, where there are some in future seasons that definitely fit that criteria. Next is Big Brother 4, which has an overall confessional amount of 2,218, and the episode sum of the season is 254, where I added all the episodes that each contestant was in, causing for that number. The rate by episode sum, which I created by dividing the prior two numbers, 8.73, and we round that up to 9, meaning that the average confessional per episode and per contestant would be 9 confessionals in order to make this an evenly distributed edit pertaining to the confessionals. Scott has an overall confessional amount of 36, and the expected count for him by episode amount is 34.9. So pretty much about 35, meaning his misallocation by episode amount is 1.07, meaning that he has one more confessional than he would have had this been evenly distributed. But his ratio is so small that he pretty much got the amount of confessionals that he should have gotten. Amanda has an overall confessional count of 31, and for her expected count by episode, which is 43.66, this means that she has a misallocation of negative 12.66, meaning that she has 12 less confessionals than she should if this were evenly distributed, which is still a fine enough number, just a bit under that balanced median by 2. Michelle has an overall confessional amount of 38, and the expected count by episode for her is 69.85. This means her misallocation by episode is negative 31.85, meaning that she has 31 less confessionals than she should have, which means she's very under-edited. David has an overall diary room count of 61. Yes, I'm using confessional and diary room interchangeably, but you all know what I mean. Anyways, his expected count by episode amount is 96. And that means that his misallocation by episode is negative 35, making him very under-edited, which is weird because he has such a huge personality, but I guess they couldn't transfer that over into interesting diary rooms. Dana has an overall confessional diary room count of 152, and her episode amount, or expected count by episode amount, is 122.25, whatever, meaning that her misallocation by episode amount is 29.74, meaning she has that amount more confessionals than she would have had this been more balanced, which is a decent amount, which is over edited but not overbearingly over edited. Nathan has an overall diary room count of 121, and his expected count by episode amount is 148, meaning that he has 27 less confessionals than he should have based on the misallocation. Justin has 141 diary rooms, and his expected count by episode amount is 174.64, meaning that his misallocation is 33 less than he should based on if this were balanced. Jack has an overall diary room count of 154, and his expected count by episode amount is 200, meaning that his misallocation by episode is negative 46.84. And he is borderline purpled. I'm not even going to lie with these numbers. Anyways, G has an overall diary room count of 225, and his expected count by episode amount is 227, meaning that he has 2 less diary rooms than he should have. But in general, this is a very balanced confessional count, all things withstanding. Erica's overall confessional diary room count is 266, and her expected count based on the amount of episodes she was in is 253, meaning that her misallocation is 13, meaning she has 13 more diary rooms than she should have if this was balanced, which is a good enough ratio, which is just above that perfect median range. Robert has an overall diary room count of 287, and his expected count by episode amount is 270, meaning that his misallocation by episode is 17 more than the average for him, which is solid enough, but not over edited. Allison's overall diary room count is 362, and her expected count by episode amount is 288, meaning that her misallocation by episode is 74.16, meaning that she has one of the largest misallocations in a positive way, in a positive way, meaning that she has one of the biggest over edits so far. June's overall diary room count is at 344, and her expected count by episode amount is 288.16 as well. But her misallocation by episode is 56.16, which is still a very large over imbalance, but nowhere near as large as Allison or even compared to Will or Danielle. So, yeah. Okay, so the season total misallocation for Big Brother 4, based off of me adding all the misallocations via house guest, is 2.53, meaning that the misallocation is only by 2. And obviously, you see the percentage of confessionals being very low, meaning that despite Allison and June having a bit too much, Dana as well, and some of the earlier boots not having as much, the imbalance is in general very small. And we will see that once we look into other seasons. So with Big Brother 5, there are 1,700 overall confessionals with an episode sum of 288, which I figured out by adding up all the episodes that each house guest was in during the season. So I divided those two numbers to come up with the rate by episode sum, which is 5.9, rounding up to 6 confessionals. So if the season and confessionals were evenly edited and distributed, each house guest would get 6 confessionals in each episode. Okay, so with Mike, he has an overall confessional diary room count of 23, and his expected count by episode amount is 23.6. So his misallocation by episode is zero point 0.6, so less than one confessional, meaning that he has a balanced confessional edit, right? Balanced regarding his distribution. Lori has an overall diary room count of 36, and her expected count by the amount of episodes she lasted is 41.31. This causes her for a misallocation of -5, which is still a pretty balanced distribution pertaining her confessional count. Holly has an overall diary room count of 49, and her expected count by episode amount is 59, meaning that her misallocation is by -10. So she literally just tipped over into being a bit under edited when it comes to a confessional count. But it's really by only zero point 0.2 decimal points. So literally, she still has a pretty solid enough distribution when it comes to her confessionals and her edit. Scott has an overall diary room count of 85, and his expected count by episode amount is 76.73, meaning that his misallocation by episode amount is 9.7, meaning he was borderline on being over edited, but he's still in that nice balancing act. So with Jace, he has an overall confessional count of 155, and his expected count by episode amount is 94.4. This means that his misallocation by episode is by 61.44, meaning that he has 61 more diary rooms than he should have had if this was a balanced edit. But it's clear that they wanted Jace to be the star of the show, and that's why his diary room count distribution is so large in comparison to everyone else. But all the other pre-jurors have solid distribution. Okay, so Will has an overall diary room count of 136, and his expected count by episode amount is 112, causing him to have a misallocation of over 24 pertaining the amount of confessionals that he got that were over the amount. Natalie has an overall diary room count of 57, and her expected count by the amount of episodes she lasted in is 129, causing her misallocation to be negative 72, which is obviously huge. Though a large part of this is definitely due to the twin twist, causing her to not even be in the house for the first 4 to 5 weeks of the season, and obviously that's going to affect her screen time and presence in the house. Adria has an overall diary room count of 118, and her expected count by episode amount is 141, causing her misallocation by episode to be negative 23. So I do think she also suffered from the twin twist when it came to the distribution of confessionals and airtime, but she wasn't nearly as affected as her sister was. Marvin has an overall diary room count of 195, and his expected count by episode amount is 147, meaning that his misallocation by episode is 48.56, meaning that he got more diary rooms than he should have if we were going by the balanced edit. But he's funny as heck, so I can't blame them. Karen's overall diary room count is 108, and her expected count by episode amount is 159, causing her to have a negative 51.37 misallocation, meaning that she was severely under-edited. And this one's weird because she's very funny and she's very witty, but they just didn't think she was worth getting much screen time, which I never really got. Nokomis has an overall diary room count of 148, and her expected count by episode amount is 171, meaning that her misallocation by episode is negative 23. So she has 23 less diary rooms than she should have if we're going for balanced distribution. Diane has an overall diary room count of 225, and her expected count by episode amount is 177, causing her to have a positive 48 misallocation, meaning that she has 48 more diary rooms than she should have if things were evenly distributed. Though it makes sense since she became one of the major narrators and players in the second half of the season. Cowboy has an overall diary room count of 171, and his expected count by episode amount is 182, causing his misallocation to be negative 11, which barely crosses over from the balance to slightly under-edited. But in general, I think he got the amount that he needed, and that fits the amount of screen time that he got. Drew's overall diary room count is 194, and his expected count by episode amount is 182, meaning his misallocation is 12.98, meaning he got 12 or 13 more diary rooms than would have been given if things were balanced. But I think he still barely crossed over into that over edited line where he still got pretty solid distribution, all things said. So the overall season total misallocation, which are all the misallocations by Haskins added together, we have a number of 10. And this kind of makes sense since all the pre-jurors, plus with the exception of Jace, got balanced edits, and a lot of the jurors who even made it to the 11, 12, 13 points in the positive or negative direction, they still got relatively balanced distribution. So this number being this small kind of makes sense. And overall, the percentages of confessionals misallocated are very small, but nowhere near as small as the prior two seasons, so I found that interesting. Though there are just less diary rooms in general from Big Brother 5 onwards, compared to BB2, 3, and 4. So Big Brother 6 has an overall confessional count of 1,746, and the episode sum for this season is 290. And with those numbers, I divided the first from the second to find out the rate by episode sum, and this is 4.19, which rounds out to 4 confessionals, meaning that for every episode, every house guest would have to have 4 confessionals in order to have a balanced edit pertaining confessionals. Ashlia has an overall diary room count of 14. Her expected count by episode amount is 12.57, meaning her misallocation by episode is 1.42, which means she has a balanced distribution. Michael has an overall diary room count of 35. His expected count by episode amount is 25.15, meaning his misallocation by episode is 9.84, meaning that he has a balanced diary room distribution. Eric has an overall diary room count of 77, and his expected count by episode amount is 37.73, meaning his misallocation amount is 39, meaning that he's pretty over edited when it comes to his distribution, but it's nowhere near the largest one. Sarah has an overall diary room count of 79, and her expected count by episode amount is 62.89, meaning her misallocation by episode is 16.10, which means she got a bit more distribution, but not much. Kesar has an overall diary room count of 139, and his expected count by episode amount is 62.89, meaning that he has a misallocation by episode of 76.10, meaning that he got twice the amount of diary rooms that he should have gotten. But I think due to him being nominated so many times and being H definitely bloated a lot of those numbers. Jennifer's overall diary room count is 65. Her expected count by episode amount is 79.66, meaning her misallocation by episode is negative 14.66, meaning that she has less diary rooms than she should have, meaning that she has a negative balance. Rachel has an overall diary room count of 128. Her expected count by episode amount is 88.05, meaning her misallocation by episode is 39, which is a pretty decent gap. James has an overall diary room count of 170, and his expected count by episode amount is 96.44, causing his misallocation by episode to be 73.55, meaning that he has almost twice the amount of diary rooms that he should have if they wanted to give a balanced edit. But James is hilarious as heck and he gives witty diary room and commentary, so I get why they gave him so much. Bo's overall diary room count is at 61, and his expected count by episode amount is 100.63, causing his misallocation by episode to be negative 39.63, which means he has pretty much almost half of the amount of diary rooms that he should have, which is a very bad imbalance, and it might be one of the worst in history, though we'll see if that holds up as we go through the seasons. Howie has an overall diary room count of 185. His expected count by episode amount is 109, causing his misallocation by episode to be 75.97. And this is definitely one of the biggest bloated over edits pertaining diary rooms that we have so far. And they found him funny, so I guess it makes sense. So April has an overall diary room count of 159, and her expected count by episode amount is 117.04, meaning her misallocation by episode is 41.95, which is a pretty decent over balance, but it's not the largest. Janelle has an overall diary room count of 210, and her expected count by episode amount is 121.6, causing her misallocation to be 88.39. And this is one of the largest, if not the largest number so far when it comes to the overdistribution of diary rooms up to this point. Who's going to beat that is Yvette, who has an overall diary room count of 230, and her expected count by episode amount is 125.79. Her misallocation by episode is 104.2, meaning she has over 100 diary rooms than she should have if this was to be a bounce edit. And I'm pretty sure this is the largest number by far, since none of the others, not even BB2 Will or BB3 Danielle, made it to the hundreds in the misallocations. Maggie has an overall diary room count of 194, and her expected count by episode amount is 125.79, causing her misallocation by episode to be 68.2, which is a pretty large amount despite her lack of presence. So I added all the misallocations of the season to create a season total misallocation number, and this one is very large, where it is 580.68. None of the other prior seasons had numbers that were this large, and this caused for the percentage of confessionals misallocated to be 0.33, meaning a third of the diary rooms in this season were misallocated poorly. Obviously, this really shows the first season that is hugely imbalanced when it comes to the editing, but it will be interesting to see if more seasons end up like this in the future regarding the future eras, or if the prior four seasons are more common when it comes to the overall edit of Big Brother Diary Rooms. So now we are moving on to Big Brother 7, and the overall confessionals in this season is 1,362. So being consistent with the last two seasons with that amount. And the episode sum is 260, where I added all of the amount of episodes that each contestant was in to create that number. The rate by episode sum is 5.23, rounding to 5 confessionals that every house guest should have gotten in every episode for there to have been a balanced edit. Allison has an overall diary room count of 24, and her expected count by episode amount is 15.71, meaning that she has an 8.28 misallocation by episode, which is a pretty fair distribution without getting overexposed. Nokomis has an overall diary room count of 23, and her expected count by episode amount is 31.43, causing her to have a negative 8.43 misallocation, just barely missing out on being under-edited. Jace has an overall diary room count of 51, with an expected count by episode amount being 47.14, causing him to have a 3.85 misallocation by episode, so he has that pretty close to perfect ratio. Diane has an overall diary room count of 44 diary rooms, where her expected count by episode amount is 62.86, causing her to be the first one in the red of this season pertaining to misallocation, as she has negative 18.86 less than she should have for a fair edit. Kesa has an overall diary room count of 42, and his expected count by episode amount is 78.57. This causes a huge misallocation for him, as his is negative 36.57, meaning that he only has a bit more than half of the diary rooms that he should have gotten for a fair, balanced edit. So Marcellus has an overall diary room count of 62, and his expected count by the amount of episodes he lasted is 94.29, causing for a negative 32.29 misallocation, meaning that he only got two-thirds of the amount of diary rooms that he should have gotten for a fair distribution edit. Howie really isn't much different, as his overall diary room count is also 62. His expected count by episode amount is 99.53, and his misallocation is negative 37.53, meaning that he missed out on almost half of the amount of diary rooms that he should have gotten. And this is kind of a consistent thing with this season and last season that I'm looking over the numbers. James has an overall diary room count of 109. His expected count by episode amount is 110, causing him to only have a negative 1 misallocation, meaning that his distribution for diary rooms is borderline close to perfect. Danielle has an overall 60 167 diary room count, with her expected count by episode amount being 125.72, meaning her misallocation by episode amount is 41, so she still got over edited when it comes to the diary rooms, but she's funny and charismatic as heck, so it makes sense. Chicken George is pretty much the opposite, as his overall diary room count is 84. His expected count by episode amount is also 125.72, but his misallocation is negative 41.72, meaning that he missed out on a third of the diary rooms that he should have gotten for a balanced edit. But it kind of makes sense since he just didn't have much going for him. So Will has an overall diary room count of 213, with an expected count by episode amount being 136.2, causing for a misallocation of 76.8. This isn't surprising since he is pretty much the star and the main strategist of the season, and he's very charismatic. So this number is fitting, but it's nowhere near the largest, which actually shocked me. Janelle has an overall diary room count of 177, where her expected count by episode amount is 141.43, causing her misallocation by episode to be 35.56. Erica has an overall diary room count of 110. Her expected count by episode amount is 146.67, causing for a negative 36.67 misallocation. Mike has an overall diary room count of 194, with an expected count by episode amount being 146.67, and his misallocation by episode being 47.32, which is a decent amount, I guess. So shockingly, when I added all the misallocations by Haskins together, I got pretty much a perfect edit or perfect misallocation since it's just a bunch of zeros. And I think this might have to do with the fact that there's no one who had twice the amount of diary rooms that they should have, like Yvette in season 6, and no one crossed that 100 misallocation by episode amount. And while certain people were under edited in this season, it was nowhere close to some of the others in BB6. So I think that's why the number here is so much smaller.